Hello, everybody, and welcome to another exciting edition of Words, Images, and Worlds. Delighted on this episode to be enjoying the powerful camera dynamics of comics creator Ben Humeniuk. We're like down here looking up. It's very Citizen Kane. I love it.
Yes, yes, it's almost intentional. I'm directing the eye just as I would on a comics panel. It's either that or the fisheye lens on my Microsoft Surface Pro just doesn't allow for a straight-on background. I feel like you've got like a Dave Gibbons Watchmen grid behind you. Like
I
Frank
do.
Miller would be very proud of your paneling a la Dark Knight Returns with your shelves.
Absolutely. We try. There's so many things going on back here. And I noticed Watchmen over your shoulder there, by the way. So,
So
uh,
that was a gift from a friend. It's Dave Gibbons like volume on how he made the book, and it's got some of his production
uh,
documents and sketches. And I always like a good look beneath the hood. So seeing some of Alan Moore's like copious typewritten scripts reproduced in there, or some of his working pencils for his pages, I'm just like, oh, give me a look under the hood. It's a really fascinating document.
Also
So
noticing you are being held by the Enterprise at least twice there as
it's
well.
it's a, it's a
Noticing
lot of
that.
times. There's another shelf over there, and the light's better on this side of the room, but that's got. There's a company called Eagle Moss that recently folded operations, sadly, but they were making a ton of die-cast models of various pop culture paraphernalia, Doctor Who figurines and TARDIS models, various Marvel hero statues, and they were making a range of Star Trek spaceships. So if anyone breaks into this house, they would be able to steal approximately 80 scale models of every Federation starship that appeared in the Star Trek
Oh,
series
wow.
from 1960 to the modern day. It's a very sad thing. The fact that I'm married with children is a surprise even to me with these kind of collecting hobbies. So I'm grateful. I'm
It's good.
grateful.
It's good. It's all good.
That's right.
Yeah, I'll mention a few titles here as well.
Mhm.
And folks on the audio version of the podcast are just loving my description of people's shelves on every episode, I'm sure. But that's an English teacher. That's what I do.
It's a good way to get into it. Yeah,
Exactly, exactly.
absolutely.
Yeah. So I'll mention Waking Life being a book that there are multiple volumes in
Hmm.
this book series. So lots of wonderful creating in that world of
Hmm.
what happens when we dream and some really interesting questions that you go about exploring. You also have a book, Making It. Making It. That is
Yeah.
out
Oh, that's
there.
a deep cut. Yes, sir. That
Hmm
is the
hmm
first independent graphic novel I've ever done. And that's an interesting one in that it's couched for a juvenile rehabilitation program based in Houston. So we made it for a
Uh,
very specific purpose. It's kind of an 11-step curriculum made into a comic book format so students can read it and discuss it. So yeah, that one has got a big place in my heart. Even though the drawing is very amateuristic at this stage, I've learned a lot since then.
we are our own hardest critics sometimes, looking
Fair,
back over
fair.
the creative journey. I read
Right.
things that I wrote 5 years ago and I go, yeah, well.
Yeah, but you're publishing academically, so you're adding to the cumulative body of knowledge in terms of comics efficacy as a vehicle for understanding and meaning and research. Which thank you, by the way, because
Oh
that
yeah.
then gives us more ground to do stuff with that academically, just in a practical application level.
Well, my pleasure, and thanks for saying it so well. Thanks for saying it so very well.
Oh,
Um,
means.
yeah, and people just love reading academic stuff anyway, so I feel like it's out there. Now, you're also, I think, your name came up on a recent episode. I believe it was with Stonie Williams,
Oh, my boy, Stonie. Yes,
perhaps.
sir. Yeah. Uh-huh.
Talking about
Uh-huh.
working in the world of, I believe it was Cthulhu, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah. Yeah. Did he give you the whole background spread on this sprawling public domain universe that we've gotten ourselves into?
Now, is it Travis Gibbs' world? Is that right?
You are right.
I
Yes.
thought so. Okay.
Godfather of North American independent comics, Travis Gibb, inviting everyone to play in his Cthulhu inspired sandboxes. But
hmm
Stoney's been doing work with Travis since his first volume, which was based in Oz. And then I kind of tugged on Stoney's pant leg and begged him to let me draw the story he wrote for the volume that takes place in, oh, shoot, no, what was between Oz? It was a take on Lewis Carroll's Carpenter and the Walrus. Actually, we did it for a
hmm
Never, or not a Never, a Wonderland inspired volume, and then we teamed up for a Neverland volume. And we've just Stony may have told you, but I'll affirm this again. We've just gotten the green light to do a short project based on the Robber's Bridegroom, which will be
hmm
fun for a Grimm fairy tales inspired Cthulhu volume. And Stoney's big challenge was how do we take a story that's naturally horrific and add a Cthulhu element that would keep it fresh and surprising. So that's the trick we're trying to pull off. But with his poetic and astute writing, I think we'll be quite successful. My job is just to draw it, and that's not too bad.
Yeah, yeah. Well, you say that, but
Mhm.
taking your time through those Lovecraftian worlds that's got to be its own challenge. And then blending in
Mm.
something like the Lewis Carroll aesthetic to that too. There's got to
Yeah.
be that sort of
Yeah.
added step. So,
Well, with that one, and as you're familiar with John Tennille's illustrations from the original Victorian volumes, those added so much life and kind of created some in jokes where the Mad Hare and the Mad Hatter, they pop up in the second Wonderland or the second Alice book, as differently named characters, but there's a little continuity.
mhm.
Stoney's brainstroke was, what if we depicted this as almost a Dr. Seussian kind of scenario? So we tried to very much draw them with like the pupils and eyelashes that Geisel would have used for his characters, while putting them in sort of a world of like evil mollusks and dolphins that were corrupt. And with this surprise EC Comics inspired gore panel, most of my work is meant for teens specifically, but all age audiences generally. I keep kind of a Pixar approach in mind, but for the work that I've gotten to do with Stony, with a distinctly more horrific bent, it's challenged me to try to add a different gear to my repertoire and see if horror is something I can convincingly pull off, in terms of creating chill, but also not creating like a deadness, because that's not the goal, right? We want
Mhm,
we want
mhm.
humanity even to come from these cautionary tales of people who have overreached or been unwise or been short-sighted,
Yeah.
and yeah, if we do it again, a lot of it comes to the writing. The drawing just is not to screw it up. So that's my mindset on that. But
And oh,
yeah,
go
I
ahead,
mean, you were talking to Dan Jurgens a couple of weeks ago, so I know you're
sorry.
familiar with talking to cartoonists who do multiple parts of the job, right? Like there were times early in Jurgens' career where he was drawing exclusively. There were times where he was writing for people like John Romita Jr. That a lot of his great Superman work has been him doing both. So I found getting to work with people like Stony or a common collaborator of ours, Travis B. Hill. We've done some short work together. We're working on a one shot that comes out next year. I learn a lot of the craft of writing from working with other writers, and that's just a joy. It's a real pleasure to do that. I want to try to keep a learner's mindset, because otherwise there's stagnation. Surely something
Oh,
you're
yeah.
familiar with again with education, and probably is that your impetus for doing these interviews? Beyond just writing about the craft and applying it, talking to creators was part of the process, just curiosity and wanting to know.
Yeah, there's definitely that part of it. And then I
Mhm.
also think about how, sometimes the creative life is so mysterious. I've done a
Hmm.
lot of work that's behind paywalls that is low access. And so I love the idea of putting something out that, it's on YouTube, it's on Spotify. Anybody can
Mhm.
sort of go and find it and hear, because there are those stories and research that I've done, but
Mhm.
they're also, sort of behind the wall of the ivory tower to a certain
Mhm.
degree. So there's definitely
Mhm.
that curiosity. There's also just a love for comics and storytelling and
Mhm.
the passion of the project as well.
So maybe we should talk about this as educators. When
hmm
you initially started pursuing research into comics, what kind of friction did you find, if any, or did you find yourself working within a department or with colleagues who were fairly open to you exploring that world?
Mostly, mostly open. In
Okay.
academia, yes, pretty open. In the public school world,
Mhm.
there were people that I knew that if I said, "Hey, I'm looking at comics and I'm doing things with comics in my classroom space," they would have gone, "Oh, well, is that complex enough? Oh, is that?" And the
Mhm.
reason I knew that
Mhm.
is because they were saying that about popular fiction, like The Hunger Games and titles like
Interesting.
that. Yeah,
Mhm.
and so I knew that there was that sort of preconceived notion of what advanced text looks like.
Mhm.
And I would make the case that comics can be very advanced
Yeah.
based on the way that you have to think through, examine the images, examine the text. So
Mhm.
mostly I've had some openness. I've
Mhm.
also had grad students who have kind of gone, but is this really reading? Is this real?
Hmm.
Um,
Hmm.
and then
Ooh,
it's
that's fun.
interesting. Yeah. Well,
Mhm.
and then they take the books and they're reading with kids, and
Mhm.
kids devour them and they go, "Oh, well, this is the first book that this child has ever finished, and I've been trying to get them into reading since who knows when."
Mhm.
So it sounds like this is perhaps an avenue to
Mhm.
explore.
It's interesting in that it's a different kind of reading. And I was thinking about this earlier. You're certainly trading off the mind's power for image connotation, right? Like I think Stephen
Mhm.
King has this great example on writing. He can talk about a white rabbit on a red table with a black hat, and boom, it's telepathy. Now that image is in your mind. And
Mhm.
comics, takes that part away. I don't see that image subjectively from my experience of white rabbits and black tablecloths. I see it the way that Dan Mora has drawn it, or Taite Kubo has drawn it, or Bill Watterson has drawn it, or Ramona Fraden has drawn it, right? So I'm trading that off. But you still have the connotative power of language. You still have ironic juxtaposition between image and word and text. I know I'm preaching to a choir here, but I get excited to parse through these ideas too, because I'm lucky to be in an environment where there's not skepticism to comics being available to students. But I don't think we're at a place where, particularly, I'm at a high school that's very keen on challenging students for college readiness, and we've got high academic standards. And if I were to propose to my colleagues to use a comic as a unit of study in my class for like 4 weeks, unless it were something like Mouse, where I can bring out the weight of the Pulitzer Prize, right? They might be skeptical. The furthest I've gotten to go is using American Born Chinese with ESL students, which was a wonderful experience. And we know Gene Yang is an incredibly complex writer. He's got those National Book Award nominations. He's a MacArthur Genius Grant. He's a fellow educator, a former educator himself. So there's a lot of bona fides there. But yeah, I'm keeping my eyes slightly open to the day where, like, okay, I can pull off is there an actual unit I can pull off around a text that's native to comics that I can show is robust and challenging and meets the demands of the TEKS in the state of Texas, the Texas essential knowledge and skills. It'd be fun to get there. Not quite there yet, but I'm wondering if someday in the future I could. And I don't know if you perhaps have any advice on that, if you've seen that used successfully in either of your tenures in different parts of education.
Yeah, I mean, I think the case is being made. I think that people are talking about that. And you mentioned the sort of the bona fides of having a Pulitzer and Newbery. It's also an interesting thing these days, because if people are going to challenge a book, it might not necessarily matter in certain spaces. But that's a whole other conversation. But
Well, we can have that one, because we just got told in my district that Beloved is off the shelf. Brave New World is off the shelf. Speak is off the shelf. And I have the Emily Carroll illustrated graphic novel version of Speak in my classroom. I've taught Speak to ninth graders before. Wonderful books. But yeah, we're in a very censorious world right now, and that's difficult when it takes those things. It's not that students can't go find them at a public library or at Barnes and Noble or on Amazon, but the exposure power of having it in a classroom is what I think some people are concerned about because of misconceptions of the work. But also, we know as educators is so powerful because of, as your book coming out in February is going to talk about, the empathy that develops when we get to put on the skin of a different character and live in their world. Like when I read Seth's story in Beloved, which I was taught at an evangelical Christian university, and seeing the power of grief and forgiveness and redemption. And at the end of the book, the climax is her gospel church community coming around her and singing the demons away as she fights Beloved off, just emotionally. That kind of power, my student will get that in the classroom just from exposure. And so I mourn that somewhat. And I'm hopeful that this season is a season. It's not a complete sea change. But again, since you alluded to it, I don't know if you've got some thoughts on what you see with censorship and how that's going with books right now and how that impacts comics potential.
I think, sharing the news of what books do have in them that's worthwhile is definitely worth the conversation, because chances are if people are challenging a book like Beloved, they're thinking about like one particular page, one particular passage. And so telling, the story of what is there. And similar with comics, there's that idea of, well, if this is an incredibly simple medium, then what's going on? Like if you and I are in panels right now, that space between us, what happens there as far as the thinking, reading mind? How do you jump from one side to the other? Or how do you start to parse apart the creative decisions that somebody makes in a panel and sort of tap into like visual foreshadowing, visual analysis in that way of looking at, well, what's the mood of this? Well, how do I know it's the mood of that? You were talking about the graphic novel adaptation of Speak. You get the emotional experience really without the words.
Yeah.
Just based on design, based on Emily Carroll's approach to rendering those experiences. And then also how powerful is that book for letting people that have been through some abusive situation know that they're not alone.
Oh man. Well, and let me even tell you a redemptive story about this. When I was teaching just the prose version to ninth graders, I think this was my first year back in the classroom after a period of time in nonprofit. We were talking, I'd had the students read the scene where the main character remembers her assault.
Hmm.
And it's not explicit, it's not graphic, it's a coming to terms with, but I had them read that on their own, and then come back to class to discuss. And I remember one of my boys was like, what if the guy was just playing around? And talk about a teachable moment where it's like,
Hmm.
if it's not playing around to her, it's not playing around. Like, this is where consent, because and that's one of those things you've got to do very carefully as an educator. But
Hmm.
again, assuming our job is to form the person and the citizen and not just teach the skill that helps them be successful in the workforce, which we do want for them. And that's a great moment to be like, you can reconsider this now that you've seen this through her perspective. She didn't feel
Hmm.
like she was being played around with. Does that change how we approach moments of intimacy with other people? Does that change how we pursue relationships? Does that change how we handle, in this case, she's at a party, people are drinking, they're underage, there's a lot of dumb stuff going on. What does that do for us? And I'm saying this to you much more eloquently than you say it in the moment. It was just very kind of quick, but to challenge a
Always,
student and
always,
say,
yeah.
hey, I wasn't playing around to her. Hopefully that's a moment that makes him think and then go on from there. So, those
Hmm.
are things that don't happen if we can't use that book,
Yeah.
unfortunately. So, yeah.
Yeah, true. How do you get to a I don't know how you would get to a conversation like that without the use of literature. It's not
No.
like you're going to come in on a random day and go, you know what, kids? You know what I was
Mhm.
thinking about? And then
Mhm.
recreate that situation of empathy and understanding and critical dialogue. I mean, those
Absolutely.
things don't just happen. We have to have authors to help us do that. Authors of comics, authors of
Mhm.
Nobel Prize winning literature, all
Of
of those
course.
things. Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. But it's so much more accessible when it's the visual. And I like how I think what you're bringing up, the fact that you don't lose inference when it comes to comics, right?
Hmm.
Like the fact
Hmm.
that I still must make meaning between clues given to me. I think that is the heaviest lifting of reading, especially for the secondary student. I'm teaching sophomores this year, for instance. Yeah, to
Same,
challenge them that
same.
way.
Hmm.
Oh, okay, gotcha. That's fan. Ooh,
Yeah.
well, we should compare the canon in a minute. I don't know. I got to respect our time limit. There's so much we could discuss.
Right, right.
Yeah.
Yeah, the text choices are always a thing, but
Mhm.
um when you're thinking about your life as a reader and the things that you bring to the classroom, does that inform what you're doing creatively as well? Are there pieces that you're sort of exploring creatively or that inform what you're practicing in comics?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think part of that is, as we know with teaching, we're doing multiple trips through a book because we're teaching different courses on the same day. So, for instance, there was a period of time where I was teaching freshmen, and I did about 3 or 4 years through Romeo and Juliet. And
Hmm.
so there were just aspects of what Shakespeare was doing in that play. I mean, talk about the waking life books, which deal with a character that literally can enter a dream reality. And here
Hmm.
we've got Mercutio giving his great Queen Mab speech about how deceptive dreams are and how they inevitably let you down, right? He's kind of foreshadowing everything that Romeo is about to go through, but he just gets, very bombastic toward the end, and they're like, oh, bro, come on, chill out. Um, I even noticed there was a passage where I was talking about the characters have to deal with a Chaucer unit in their high school classroom. And I'm
Yeah.
like, oh, Chaucer's not that bad, but he's an antagonist to them because they don't like, early modern English poetry, I guess, or ancient Middle English or late Middle English. Or I don't know. Where do we put Chaucer in that spectrum right here? Does he considered a forerunner of modern English, or is he actually squarely in that tradition? I know he's
I think
codifying a
he's a
lot of.
forerunner. There's
He's a forerunner,
definitely, I mean, you're talking very French inspired Old
right?
English. Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
and it kind of sounds like a Norwegian person when you're like enabled with shower to shoot, and yeah,
Uh-huh,
I
uh-huh.
that's fair. He's codifying a lot of vocabulary that like is not set on various sides of the Thames, probably.
Right,
But
yeah.
no, it does work in, and so this year Um, I'm teaching Julius Caesar, and it's been about 11 years since I've been through that work. And I've just been sitting a lot with what Brutus says about the abuse of greatness is when remorse is removed from power. Like
Mm-hmm,
that's your criteria. If I've got power and I don't have conscience, that
mm-hmm,
makes me bad. And his fear is that that's where Caesar's at. It's just sitting with me for the works that I'm working on. And the one shot that I'm drawing from Travis Hill's script deals with a character in a post-apocalyptic world
mm-hmm,
who's seeing abuses of power. He's seeing essentially a religious cult that's taken a section of low resource territory and is abusing a people group there. And we've kind of got this drifting gunslinger in the apocalypse who's going to make things right. But it's a very violent story. And what I'm wrestling with there is there a cost even to the violence that he enacts on those that from our story world deserve it. These are harmful people. They're hurting people who are defenseless. When he gets R-rated revenge on them, do we have a moment where we show the cost of that, or do we just get kind of like the spray of viscera and on to the next thing? And this is not to critique Travis's script. He's very conscious about a lot of Travis's work comes back to abuses of power and what it does to communities that are harmed by that. But in trying to render this, I'm like, do I go, full, John Wick balletic, whatever, or is there a little bit of the Daniel Warren Johnson tradition of, man, this is brutal and that costs something for everyone involved?
Yeah.
And can Caesar help me think about that? Is there some remorse in the power that's being enacted? So that's kind of a circuitous way of saying yes. And those are some examples.
I love it. I love it.
Yeah. I mean, for yourself, since empathy is really centered in your upcoming work that you're writing, was there something specific you read in the comic space or conversations you were having with comics creators that was drawing you to talk about empathy specifically in terms of how texts make meaning there?
I think a lot of it came, the time of the pandemic, the time of being isolated by
Yeah.
myself. There was definitely a lot there as far as unpacking what books can do because I was reading a lot in the pandemic.
Yeah.
And then this was also the time when book bans were just starting to sort of begin to creep up and escalate. So just thinking about choosing books for my students that they could then take to their classrooms because at the time I was working with undergrads and graduate students in online classes. And there were titles like New Kid, Jerry Craft that I would read and go, "Hey, this is not like my experience, and yet it's also like my experience." And When Stars Are Scattered is actually like the central text of the entire book. So, what can you do with a graphic novel, and then how does that connect to other works along the way that can be brought in to have these conversations? So, those were a couple, but I was reading a lot during the pandemic. I was exploring and digesting, and my journey with comics kind of re-upped probably about 10 years ago or so.
Okay.
Through working on a doctorate, through practicing in a middle grades classroom at the time. And, I'd kind of left them behind and still read occasionally, but they weren't really the focus of what I was doing quite as much. And so they've definitely re-entered my reading life. That's mostly what I read right now when I'm not reading something for the classroom.
Interesting. So you're either reading academic or practical texts, or you're enjoying some sort of comics narrative. You've probably spoken about it in the past on the podcast, but just for my edification, what was the book or set of books that reawakened that love for you? Did you come across like some Vertigo titles and you're like, oh yeah, Preacher is the Light, or was it more like, hey, amazing stuff is being done by Raina Telgemeier, or whatever?
Oh yeah, it was more stuff in the indie spaces, I
Very cool.
think. Yeah, the corners of what wasn't quite on everybody's radar is working with a guy named Sturge Bitsakis,
Okay.
and we're good friends now. He was my dissertation chair, and so yeah, getting to learn about like first, second books, for example, and the different kinds of books that they're publishing right now. And Raina Telgemeier was kind of there, but that was more kind of in my classroom brain. That wasn't something I was reading for myself at the moment. So yeah, like Fantagraphics work first, second, and then some of the indie creators that are out there as well.
Gotcha. And
yeah,
it's surprising even with first, second, because I think they get rightly they develop a lot of young adult appropriate content, but they also have stuff that's far afield from that, right? Like that's not necessarily just YA content. It's a little more adventurous, which I appreciate that they bring that to market. So that's cool.
Yeah. And books for younger readers too. I mean, they have a nice assortment of materials.
That's fair.
But yeah. And then this was how I came across your work, because when I'm exploring and I'm finding more books to read and more books to read, it's like, oh, well, here's this person, and sort of going on that like Amazon or Goodreads recommendation quest. Is really that's a wonderful place to be, of discovering voices that are out there.
That's fantastic. I think I view myself very much at the burgeoning end of my time in comics, and if luck and fate and God's will hold, so to speak, I think this is a career to be in for decades, and I hope to be creating my best work at age 60. I'm 37 right now,
Yeah,
but I
yeah,
very much see myself as a teacher and a comics creator. In addition to that, up to the point where I can retire, and I think at that point I'll invest a lot of energy into creating more work. But I'm pleased that some of it is, in a space where it can be found. I'm delighted that you found it just
oh
through
yeah.
looking through connections to other works, and that's fun. I think one of the pleasant surprises about comics, and I think you've probably seen this to be true as well, is just how much community is around the
Mhm.
creative group that does comics in North America. There are so many kind of tendrils of connection that exist between different people who make different works. It's been fun to start to stumble into that, and to see how that grows. And I don't know. I'm wondering, do you see any crossover from some of your academic colleagues, who also connect with other creators who are doing active work, or maybe who are kind of middling it, being in the MFA space, for instance, finding terminal work there?
Yeah, I mean there's an interesting thing that's happening right now because I also do stuff on creative research methods,
Mm-hmm.
in like qualitative research design.
Mm-hmm.
And so you look at somebody like Nick Susanis's work,
Oh,
uh, yeah, unflattening, and
yeah.
you have a dissertation in graphic novel form. So there's definitely that
Mm-hmm.
idea that using visual, using arts, using dance, those are not things that are completely devoid of academic life, that the
Mm-hmm.
creative and the academic are not completely separated. And I'm sure there's still people out there that don't make those connections and don't bring those things together. But that also is something that I try to take to the classroom with me as far as, okay, we're going to do essays. We're going to do research essays. Absolutely. We have to do the research paper thing,
Mm-hmm.
but there are also multimodal ways of creating.
Mm-hmm.
There are different ways of accessing content and accessing ideas. And, not all of my students love comics. Some of them
Mm-hmm.
do, some of them don't. So, I mean, is it one way of storytelling? Is it one way of responding, or is it all of these multiple ways
Mm-hmm.
that we can have as human beings?
Mm-hmm. Broaden the avenues to making
Mhm,
that meaning. Yeah,
mhm.
I track with that. As someone who is grading high school research papers right now, when we give them broad parameters to write what they're interested in and to write how they're interested in that, oh my gosh,
Yeah.
the work you get, ooh,
Oh yeah.
there's some good stuff.
Yeah,
Good
yeah.
stuff.
Well, I love giving, a nice kind of general rubric that's got some points on it, and then the student gets to decide how they're going to meet those points. If
Mm-hmm.
it's a podcast, if it's
Mm-hmm.
created like painting kind of work, if it's I've had people use Procreate. I've had students
Oh,
do that in the past
mm-hmm.
year and come across with really interesting adaptations of The Great Gatsby in Procreate. So,
Interesting. Yeah,
yeah, yeah.
which is
I just
nice.
continue to play with ideas.
Sure. Well, especially since that works now in the public domain, they can do a lot with that. So that's
That's right. That's right. Yeah.
oh man,
Yeah.
that's excellent. I love that. That's really encouraging to hear. Especially, I've got one boy who just wrote a really fantastic essay. He did not use MLA format. He got docked points for that.
Oh,
Um,
yes. So.
but all this said, he's writing at a collegiate level as a sophomore, and he wrote about the history of asylums. Went back
Oh,
to the
wow.
Roman Empire and how slaves who were mistreated could throw themselves at the mercy of a god, and that was a shame to their master, and they would be reassigned to a different person. And how that led to the tradition of the asylum, which was abolished in the 1800s. He's basically giving me this whole history of like a thing that I only know from Batman comics and like Arkham Asylum. That's what I know.
Mhm, mhm, mhm,
And then
mhm.
he pivots that to recommend a future version of institutionalization that's very client based, that's very naturally based. He used research on like how natural environments can affect people. Just this wild piece of work that I'm like, this dude's going to go off to be a research prof. Like I am
Oh,
seeing the
yeah.
beginning of his trajectory here because he's reading classics for fun and whatever. And just to be around those minds and have those perspectives is like, okay, I would never in a million years recommend the reinvention of asylums.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
I see this argument, and wow, he's done some homework on this. And I get that he's saying this can be done differently. How fascinating. It's just like, this is why we teach, right?
Yeah.
It's not just to
Absolutely.
pour things in, it's the, what are they coming up with? Whoo, that's the
But
fun.
on the other side of that, you
Mm-hmm.
created the space with him for that conversation to happen, you know? So
That's
that
fair.
there's something to that on the teacher side too, and for teachers out there that are listening, that are
Mhm.
going, "Oh yeah, I've got this creative kid, and maybe
Mhm.
they're the next Foucault or something like that." Because how often do you say that to yourself? Maybe they're the next Foucault. But it's also in the decisions that teachers make of, is it all multiple choice? Do I allow for this space and kind of see where it goes,
Yeah.
or do I just immediately say, no, it's got to be this one thing?
Mhm.
So hats off. I'm not wearing a hat, but hats off to you as well.
Well, I'm gonna take that with me this week, Jason. You're gonna be the bird on my shoulder saying make some space, and that's good. Ooh,
There
that's a
you
whole
go.
meal right there. Woo-hoo.
There you go. There you
Yeah.
go. So for dessert, where
Ah,
can people go to find out more about your work?
thank you
That's
for
usually kind of a closing question. So
yeah.
a good time for dessert.
Good time for dessert. Yeah. For myself, my website is benhumeniuk.com. It's just my name, benhumeniuk.com. And that's got information about the work that I've been doing, including the Waking Life graphic novels, the second volume of which just came out through
Mhm,
Comiker
mhm.
Press, as well as previous works like Brody Can't Be Broken, which is through Band of Bards, and The Magnificent Makers, which is through Rosen Publishing's Power Kid Press imprint.
Fantastic. Fantastic. Any future works or creative directions you want to mention before we close?
Thank you for giving me that opportunity. Yes.
Hmm.
So the post-apocalyptic comic I was referring to is called A Last Goodbye. Travis B. Hill is the writer. I'm illustrating that. That will be out through Band of Bards in April of 2024 through local comic shops. It'll be a 40-page limited color one-shot, post-apocalyptic action with a bit of a moral conscience woven in. And then there will be a trade paperback reissue of Brody Can't Be Broken, which is essentially a romance comic hidden inside of a 64-page shonen action beat up extravaganza. But I'm revising that for print, and that should be out in July 2024, also through Band of Bards. And then, with luck and a prayer, Waking Life Volume 3 should be out either late 2024 or early 2025 from Comiker Press.
Fantastic, fantastic. Well, Ben, it's been a wonderful chat. I've really enjoyed talking with you, and may the conversation continue. Glad to have you back for a part two at some point.
I would love that. That'd be fantastic.
Yeah, let's plan on it for sure.
Thanks so much, Jason. I appreciate you.
Yeah, thank you.